Welcome to the Bluestocking Circle podcast, Lady Nerds on Popular Culture. We're your hosts, B,
Purcell,
and Kat.
This is episode 38, Ella Enchanted. In today's episode, we will be discussing the 1997 novel Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine, as well as the 2004 movie adaptation. We will be spoiling both works, so stop listening if you don't wish to be spoiled. And that is totally a suggestion, not a command. You are free to do as you wish. Ready?
This is going to be a wild ride.
Ella Enchanted is the debut novel of Gail Carson Levine. Published in 1997, it received the Newbery Honor the following year, a distinction given to books deemed to have made a significant contribution to the field of children's literature. The novel is a retelling of the classic fairy tale Cinderella, set in a fantasy world populated by elves, gnomes, ogres, giants, fairies, and other magical beings. In this version of the story, the protagonist, renamed Ella, has been cursed at birth by a fairy to always be obedient, which compels her to follow any order she is given. Years before the famed stroke of midnight, Ella goes on a quest to free herself of her curse, along the way encountering carriage-sized pumpkins, glass slippers, and a prince named Char. The story builds up to the famed ball where Ella finally achieves her happily ever after, but in this version, there's a lot more adventuring and even a slow burn epistolary romance along the way. Ella Enchanted was adapted into a movie of the same name in 2004, starring Anne Hathaway as the title character. This film adaptation took the title, premise, and character names from the book, but little else. It gave the story a far more comedic, even parodic tone, and created a world more similar to our own turn-of-the-millennium culture than to the original fairy tale. Levine herself did not seem overjoyed by the adaptation, stating it was, quote, so different from the book that it's hard to compare them, end quote. Fans and critics weren't overjoyed either. The movie made under $30 million at the box office worldwide, a paltry sum, and holds only a 50% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Nonetheless, it has its fans just as the book does, among them Roger Ebert himself, who gave it 3.5 stars upon its release. Since publishing Ella Enchanted, Levine has written over a dozen books, many of them fantasies starring complex young heroines like Ella herself. In 2018, over 2 decades after Ella's introduction, she returned to Ella's own world in the prequel Ogre Enchanted. But for now, let's go back to the book that started it all, Once Upon a Time. And with that, we can go on to our newbie synopsis. Griselle?
A foolish fairy gives an ill-conceived gift to a crying baby, thus making her obedient for life. Her mother dies, her father is negligent, and her eventual stepfamily is not great, but also not as bad as she makes them out to seem until they make her their servant for plot reasons. And there's a prince.
Well, we're going to have to quibble on the not as bad as she makes them out to seem part, Griselle, but well done. That is an excellent newbie synopsis. And with that, we can go on to our origin stories. I mentioned in our Babysitters Club episode that I used to order books from the Scholastic catalog as a kid, and one of those books was Ella Enchanted. I don't remember why I ordered it. Maybe I just liked the book cover, or perhaps the summary mentioned Cinderella, which has always been one of my favorite Disney movies, but I did order it and it was love at first read. It immediately became my favorite book, and I reread it so often as a tween girl that I had entire passages memorized. As for the movie, I was still relatively young and innocent back then, so I was super excited when it was announced. I had really liked the Princess Diaries movie, and thus I was thrilled that Anne Hathaway, i.e. Princess Mia, had been cast as Ella. Surely the movie of my favorite book would be a masterpiece with such excellent casting, my young, sweet self thought. But alas, as I said in the last minisode's first impressions segment, I didn't like the movie when I saw it, and it's one of the first times I remember being unhappy with an adaptation of a book I loved. Maybe it's the first time. I still bought the DVD because I'm nothing if not loyal, but no matter how many chances I gave the movie over the years, I never could manage to like it. Until now? We shall see. Kat, what about you?
Well, I definitely only had vague impressions or notions of this book and movie. Basically, I had seen it on the shelf. I knew the book cover. I knew that it was sort of based on Cinderella, and I had seen the DVD cover, but I never got much further than that until now.
I have to ask, B. You say this is the first time you hated a movie adaptation. Is this what set you up for all the others, really?
It was the first of a long, dark journey.
It's a tragedy.
Grissa, what's your origin story for Ella Enchanted?
Okay, so I thought I had repressed a connection to this story, but alas, I did not. I knew within the first few pages of the prologue that I had definitely not read this book ever, and I was only seconds into the opening of the film, which are very memorable, that I had also not seen this film. So at most, I'm fairly certain that I have seen the almost stabbed the prince scene in Spanish, probably, while visiting my mom, because that's where all of my weird random movie experiences happen. But I had never actually seen this film. There was absolutely no way that I could have forgotten this. And I guess I was a genuine newbie after all.
All right. Thank you for those origin stories. And that's the end of the episode. Thank you very much for joining us. See
We are
you next
done.
time on the Blue Stocking Circle podcast.
I wouldn't blame you, Garcelle, if you had repressed any memories
I was
of
like,
this
there's no way
movie
I could have
experience.
forgotten this. This is a lot.
I had actively repressed it, and I wish I had left those memories undisturbed. And with that, you can imagine how positive this episode is going to be. I will say it right up front. We did not like this movie, not one iota. There was much venting in the Discord server as we watched and suffered through the movie individually. But let's go to it. With the origin stories complete, I would officially like to kick off the discussion portion of the episode by issuing a public apology for making you two watch this movie. I'm so sorry. I don't have the energy to list everything that's terrible about it, but this should prove an interesting catharsis corner in particular.
It's all a catharsis.
I'm hoping we can salvage some positivity from the book, at least.
I will say it was a fun experience watching the movie. I wouldn't say it's a good movie, but it's definitely an experience. And I don't think you need to apologize for subjecting us to this because it's definitely a memorable experience that I may make other people suffer through.
I had a good time
Wow.
making fun of it.
Yeah, I feel like it's a fun movie to just make fun of and just
That was a good part.
While we're here, let's just give our overall impressions of. Let's start with the movie, I suppose, since we're on that topic. Anything to add besides it's terrible but fun to make fun of?
I had no expectations for the movie, and it took me maybe 30 minutes to realize, oh, this is just actually a really bad movie, and I can just like enjoy it for being bad. Because up until that point, I was just like, is this gonna change into a good movie? Like, there are good actors in it, and it seems like people are trying, but it really doesn't work, and it's laughably bad, at least.
I agree. I feel like once you give up trying to think that it's a serious film, you can just enjoy it for what it is, which is kind of zany and all the things tossed together. So it's not the worst thing I've experienced. I will say that as I was reading the book, I was having flashbacks to Zorro because that was what this experience felt like. I did not really like either of the two works, but I feel like I'm more critical of the book than I am the film. So there might be a lot of ranting from me as far as the book goes. The movie I can just take as a weird product and leave it at that, but I had more concerns about the book.
The minute you said the word zorro, my eyebrows just raised so much they're lost in my hairline somewhere at this point. What? I had no idea you had reacted so poorly to the book. Let's go ahead and talk about that. Really? Zorro?
That was
That bad?
exactly, yes. Although, minus the horrible gratuitous rape, which, that we can always repress. Yeah, I don't know. I came into this book, I feel like you tricked me with Zorro too. I came in expecting better. And so I was so let down when I did not like it that I was like, oh, this is not good. I don't like it at all. So that was the vibe I got as I was reading.
I am sorry to hear that. I really thought you would like it.
I thought I would too.
Kat, do you have anything positive to say about the book?
Well, I'll say that I liked the book more than the movie, so that's definitely a positive. And as just a quick little nugget, I will say that in the book, they talk about how fairies have very small feet. And as a rather tall person who has proportionately small feet for my body, and which I've always blamed my feet for making me very clumsy, I was happy to see that as a trait of fairies.
Aha, so some good came out of this. We've discovered your secrets, Kat, thanks to Ella Enchanted.
Yes.
Okay, well, I am interested in hearing what promise to be very passionate thoughts, shall we say. So let's dive right into our first segment, Ship Wars. I'm going to start this segment by saying that I don't even know who I am anymore. When I remembered Ella Enchanted before rereading it this time, I always remembered Ella running away from finishing school to mingle with the elves and taming ogres and going to the giant's wedding to confront Lucinda and so on and so forth. Basically, what I remembered from the book was the quest parts of the plot. And apparently, my brain had repressed the entire last half of this book and the fact that this book is a romance, and I was shocked to realize that my former favorite book was a kissing book. Go ahead and say what you will of that, Crystal.
So I actually think I would have liked this more if it was a quest book. I think there's so much happening in this book, and one of the things that really bothered me was the fact that it tried this like romance subplot. I wouldn't call it a romance in itself, but it tries to build this romance subplot that just completely fell flat to me. And I don't know, like the plot is just so all over the place. I couldn't follow the timeline as far as like when Ella was with her mom, how old she was when her mom dies, randomly meeting this guy at the funeral, and then all these random little encounters that they have, and then the letter writing. Like there was just so much happening, and so much of it stemming from basically just like situational happenstance. Like none of it seemed connected to me, and that subplot of romance kind of like to shoehorn this into the fairy tale happy ever after kiss at the end was one of the things that did not work for me. If it had been just a girl going off and having this adventure, if those like, I don't know, like 10 pages or whatever in the middle when she goes adventuring had been the whole story, I maybe would have actually liked this book, but it was just so much and so little of it made sense to me.
That's actually what stuck in my head all those years, the pages of adventuring. I remembered almost nothing that happened in the book after her quest.
Yeah, I just found that like there was a lot of lack of motivation and goal building in this book, let alone other types of building. But she goes off and you think she's finally going to do something. She's going to go break this curse, but nothing happens. And then she runs into Char, whose name is annoying. That's it. That's what happens.
I will say that it took me an embarrassingly long time to realize Char and Prince Charming and that whole connection. But I will say, I think it's funny that the romance is the part of the book that I think we all were not as appreciative of. And I will say that I also wish that this book was just the quest part or even just her at finishing school. But it's funny because it's basically retelling Cinderella, which is all about like this love at first sight or trying to find this person you had this immediate connection with. And I like that their love story is given more than just that immediate attraction and meeting, but it still wasn't very convincing or exciting, their romance. Although I do love a letter-based romance, so I actually like the letter writing.
I'm going to go ahead and interject at this point to explain how the book is different from the movie because I think at this point in time, a lot of people are more familiar with the movie than the book. And the book is extremely different, first and foremost in tone. The book is humorous, but it's not a comedy like the movie is. And second of all, the book completely changes how Ella and Char meet and their whole trajectory. In the movie, they start off as enemies and there's this political bent, which we'll discuss later on. But in the book, they meet at her mother's funeral. Her mother was a noblewoman, so he's there attending in his duties as the prince. And from establishing that tentative friendship early on at that moment, they keep meeting throughout the years, basically while she's on her quest, and he comes in with the ogre situation and all of that. And eventually they become friends through letter writing. And they correspond for a year until they meet at his ball again when they're 16. So the book takes place over 2 years from when Ella is 14 to when Ella is 16. And there's quite a few meetings with Char over the years, but most of their relationship is developed through letter writing when he's away in a different kingdom for a year.
I was super confused about the timeline, and I think your summary actually serves as a good Cliff's Notes even for me, because throughout the book, I had no idea how much time was happening. I thought in the beginning that when her mom died, she was about 8 years old, and then she met him, because the way they describe her relationship with her mom and how playful they were, she didn't seem like she was even in her tweens yet. She just seemed like a little girl. And then suddenly her mom dies, and she meets this kid. So I was picturing like two random kids. He's just a couple of years older than her meeting at this funeral. So in my mind,
You were picturing Ned and Chuck.
yeah, totally. I was picturing children in this book. And then suddenly she gets sent to finishing school, which tends to be of the older kid situation. And I just couldn't follow what was happening because it didn't make sense to me that this girl was having an epistolary romance with this random guy. And then they actually spell out the fact that she's 15 because she wants to marry him. And it's so weird to me. I did not like it.
Yeah, they're rather young. They establish early on in the story that her mom married when she was 16, so that's kind of the precedent set for marriageable age in this kingdom, but it's still extremely young to our eyes.
I was equally confused by the timeline throughout. The book also starts when she's a baby, basically, and first receives this curse, and then talks about her growing up and different ages and how, the curse affects her. So by the time the story sort of actually starts when her mother dies, I too thought that she was like 8 or 9. And I really had no sense of how long she was at finishing school for because she runs away, so she doesn't finish finishing school. But
You said that right. That's actually what it's called.
yeah. But I really had no idea how long she had been there for because the book really just like brushes over it. Like she gets there and she's sort of disobedient, but then she falls in line and now the teachers like her, but then the teachers don't like her. And I had really no idea how long she was there for. I had no idea how long she was
I
questing
agree.
for.
I felt the same as Kat. I thought this was condensed to like a handful of weeks, maybe a couple of months.
Yeah.
My interpretation was 1 semester at finishing school, or the medieval equivalent thereof.
It was very confusing, and I agree.
See, that's the other thing. It doesn't feel medieval to me. There's so much wrong with the world building of this book. And if you're going to go into the whole idea of, well, their ages and it's fantasy and it's pretending to be medieval, but like, it's not really. It's like this completely made up fantasy world that doesn't really match any other kind of fantasy that you've read because it's not very well done, in my opinion. And I'm just like, it's the same rationale that you get from like fantasy writers who are like, well, in ye olden days, women were raped. And it's like, yeah, in ye olden days, we didn't have dragons. Like, why is this girl wanting to get married when she's 15 years old? Why is any of this happening? Why is there finishing school in the medieval times? There was no finishing school in that time. There was no school. It's like, what is going on in this book?
We can discuss that at length in Catharsis Corner, and I'm sure we will. But for ship wars, let's go ahead and bring it back to Ella and Char now, and to the letter writing. Does it work for you? Like we've said, it's trying to build on the story of Cinderella and trying to give Cinderella and Prince Charming, here in this book known as Ella and Char, more of a basis for their relationship before the ball so that it doesn't come as suddenly as it does in the traditional fairy tale that he magically falls in love with her with one night. This relationship has actually been building in the background for several years before that stroke of midnight. So, how does it or does it not work for you?
It does not work for me because if this is a Cinderella, I mean, if we're going to go into fairy tale histories and all that, like, if you're basing it on Cinderella, the whole point of Cinderella and most fairy tales is like, a cautionary tale preparing the women of the time to accept these like completely absurd marriage situations nowadays. So the idea behind a Cinderella type of narrative is like you come from family circumstances that are kind of trash, and your circumstances will be improved by marrying into money. And maybe you're in love, and that's great. And maybe that love is completely superficial, but it's better than the situation you're in where your sister's willing to cut her toes off to put your shoe on. So it doesn't work for me here because I don't see, like, there's no big stakes for her to fall in love with Char. She could just as easily just run off and live with the ogres if she wanted to.
That's a good point, Grisel. Is she in love with Char? Because one of the things that stood out to me this time is that he seems to be very devoted in love with her. But she says that his main appeal is the fact that he's in love with her. So do we think that Ella actually had feelings for him, or was he just, as you're saying, Grisel, a pathway to a better life?
Well, I do like that one of the other things she likes about him is that he laughs at her jokes. So I do relate to that. He laughs at her jokes and he likes her a lot. And through that, she sort of comes to some sort of sense of feelings for him. But I agree, I'm unclear on how strong her feelings are because, as Grisel pointed out, like her family situation is sort of a driving factor at the point where he returns to her life. So I don't really know if it is more of just like, oh, hey, I could get with this guy and get away from like these terrible people and my father who just like abandoned me basically. And he's nice enough and he laughs at my jokes. So yeah, this seems good.
I think also the fact that they've developed a relationship, whether it's platonic or, if there's real attraction there, which again, at 15, what do we really know about attraction if we're taking it, that step further? But I would also say that regardless of what he can offer her, he just offers her like understanding. She hasn't had that since her mom died. Everybody either wants to use her or use her power or just treat her badly or just neglect her entirely like her dad. So no matter what, he just offers understanding, which might be more worthy than love in some ways. So there's that. I don't doubt that she feels something towards him, but it didn't feel like this should be the real motivation for this entire book to hinge on. And it kind of only becomes the thing in the second half of the book. That's where it kind of all gets thrown together. I feel like this story suddenly throws in the bad family up until the point where she goes off to finishing school. Like, Dame Olga is just, a widow who happened to marry her father for financial reasons or whatever. And her kids are annoying. There's some weirdness with her two daughters, but Hattie, likes to make Ella do things. She happens to have magic, and that's a bad thing. But, like, you also get siblings who maybe treat each other poorly in real life, so it doesn't seem like a big deal. Everything kind of becomes worse right at the point of the book where Char starts to matter, where he becomes an attractive option. So it just seems like that's where I said, like, for plot reasons, the family becomes a lot more negative than they were in the beginning of the book, where they were just kind of like, whatever. She's not great, but she's not the worst. She's not physically harming her, starving her, or anything like that. Like, Hattie starts to do all of her shenanigans when they get to finishing school, but nothing really happens until the point when you're supposed to really want her to get out and marry Char. And again, 15 years old. Book written for children.
I agree with most of what you're saying, but I do think that Hattie, and to a lesser extent Olive, are pretty terrible early on. Hattie has no respect for Ella whatsoever, looks down on her from the beginning. She is stealing Ella's property from the beginning, namely her mother's necklace. That's in the movie as well, though it's in a different context. Hattie is, in my opinion, a bad person from the beginning to Ella, but once she figures out Ella's curse, that's when it really ramps up and it does become abusive, in my opinion. And Olive is clueless the entire time, but she sees what Hattie is doing and she tries to benefit as well by taking Ella's money and possessions and all of that. So I do think that it's gotten to a much worse point by the time that the romance is introduced in the book, but I see it as being pretty bad early on.
I slightly have to disagree, though. So the first thing you get from the story, as far as like your first introduction to Hattie and Olive, is Ella's thoughts, because this is all first person point of view. And Ella's thoughts are consistently poking at Hattie's looks. You're made to assume that she's overweight, and this is implied in the way she eats. She has like bad teeth. There's a lot about Olive that comes through in the writing that Ella kind of makes fun of. Olive is obviously illiterate or has a learning disability. So there's some like low level bias and prejudice that comes through from Ella's point of view before you even see Hattie do any of her stuff. Like, you already get the feeling that Ella has already found herself to be in some ways above these two girls for whatever reason. So it doesn't build in any great way. Like, it's basically just girls being pitted against girls, and I didn't like any of that, but it starts from Ella's perspective, and just you're led to hate these people right from the start before they've done anything at all.
I will agree that Ella's point of view towards them is extremely negative from the start. I will also, in Ella's defense, say that she meets them at her mother's funeral. These two girls saunter into the funeral, barely give any expression of condolences to Ella at what's the lowest point in her life, and immediately start talking about how much the food is worth and how the house looks, and making criticisms of her and her property at the lowest point in Ella's life. So I do think that Ella's negative feelings towards them are understandable because of the context. In the movie, it's not that way. She tries to make an effort to be friendly to Hattie and Olive at the beginning, and they meet when her father has already married Dame Olga. That's not the case in the book. I would argue that Hattie and Olive's lack of sympathy at Ella's mother's funeral is what leads Ella to have such a negative perception of them, to the point that, as you point out, she does start criticizing their looks and their behavior and all of that. It's petty, but I would say it's warranted given the callousness that the two girls express at that moment. Your rebuttal, Grisel.
I mean, I can't really argue with that. I still don't think Ella is great as a character, but none of this is going to change my opinion about the book.
We're not here to change opinions. We're here to express our thoughts and have some fun. But if we really want to argue, Grisel, I will say that Ella and Char reminded me of Lizzie and Darcy this time. Do you want to express some outrage at this point or keep it to the end?
I can only see that in the movie. I can't see it in the book. I found them both equally boring as characters, and I didn't find, like I said, a lot of connection between them. Like, their back and forth I just found really dull. So I didn't see anything particularly witty or snappy about either of them in their conversations. In the movie, I can see, that there's some banter, especially when they first meet and he's inadvertently giving her commands and she gets like stuck in the road and stuff and he's like, what are you doing? And she's like, oh no, it's all your fault. So obviously not like that. But the banter in the movie, I can say, okay, yeah, it's got a I don't like you at first, but I'm kind of into you vibe. But or at least, in the book, she definitely just meets him and they kind of build. But in the movie, it's very like quick and she's already has a kind of negative opinion about him because of the political stuff that's going on. So I could say in the movie that might be the vibe they're going for, especially because the movie skews older with like obviously I don't know how old Anne Hathaway is in the movie. I'm pretty sure Hugh Dancy is at least 20 years old in that film. So they're skewing towards a teen to young adult audience.
Anne Hathaway was in her early to mid 20s. Hugh Dancy was in his early 30s, and they were actually dating
What?
after the movie. Yes.
What?
Whoa.
Why does
Wow.
he look
Okay.
12?
They were actually dating.
Oh my God. My
I
mind
really
is blown. The
Fun
podcast
fact.
is over.
I know. I did not think that they had great chemistry, and I have a lot of questions, but okay.
We've learned something new. We're all the wiser for that. Crystal, to go to your point, that's funny because I got the Lizzie and Darcy vibes from the book. I'm pretty sure I had not read Pride and Prejudice by the last time I read Ella Enchanted, so it had never crossed my mind before. But there's a point in their letter writing when they're getting extremely personal that Char basically writes to her almost verbatim that his good opinion, once lost, is lost forever. And her reply to him in her letter is that she cannot laugh at that, though she dearly loves to laugh. And I thought it was just such an obvious allusion to this classic romance that it really stood out to me this time.
If I recall correctly, isn't she purposely trying to make herself out to be a horrible person in the book because she doesn't want her power to in some way make him vulnerable? So she's writing him these letters pretending that she's marrying somebody else because she doesn't really love him. So I can see him losing his good opinion of her.
Oh, I think it's a little bit later on that I'm referring to. Yes, you're right. She does write in that letter, basically pulling a Lydia that she's run off with Wickham for money. But that's after he's already confessed his feelings of love for her. And she does that in response so that they won't get married, so that they won't be able to use their powers against him. But the Lizzie and Darcy vibe came across to me a little bit earlier on. But with that, let's move away from the romance and talk about the friendship, because there's supposed to be a very important friendship in this book, which the movie has to an extent as well. And that's the friendship between Ella and Areda. Areda calls Ella her best friend to Char when they meet in the book, but it didn't ring true to me. I remember them as being much better friends in my memories than I had the impression when I read the book this time. I think it's what you're both saying, that the time in finishing school isn't long enough to really develop that friendship, since that's where they meet in the book. And it seemed to me very one-sided in that I didn't get the impression that Ella cared much for Areda as much as Areda cared for her. What were your thoughts on that particular relationship in the book?
I think that overall, this book just seemed to have too many things happening at once, and like everything felt very rushed through. So that friendship basically is like a tiny blip in this book. And I feel like it really didn't get developed enough. There wasn't enough time spent at school, or even really, there wasn't enough time given to why they like each other or why they hang out, other than that they're both the outcasts at school. But she really just gets forgotten about until, like, a one-time check-in later on through her magic book. Ella sees that the Prince Char has stayed at Arita's family's inn, and so she just gets, like, information about the prince through this, like, personal journal entry. So it wasn't even like she was checking in on her friend to see how she was doing. She really just checks in because it's tied to Prince Char. It just fell flat for me, their friendship.
I agree with you, Kat, and I find that especially disappointing considering that supposedly the impetus for Ella running away from finishing school is that Hattie orders her to end her friendship with Areda, and she's so upset by this development that she can't even handle staying in the same building anymore. So it just didn't work for me. I didn't find it convincing. What did you think, Rosal?
I felt that she was a plot device. One, to get Ella to finally do something, because Ella does a lot of internal complaining about the curse and internal struggling and then acting out every time somebody makes her do something in order to get back at them. But she doesn't ever just leave, which she's totally free to do. There's nothing literally stopping her from leaving. Nobody has told her, you must stay here. So she could just wander off. Areta is used as a plot device for her to run away. And then she's used as a plot device to connect back to the Char thing. And that's kind of all that she serves.
I can't disagree. In other words, I agree, Grisel. And I think that's a nice transition into our feminist rant. There's a lot to discuss and to rant about in the book, as we've just alluded to, but also in the movie. There is so much that I don't even know where to begin. For example, the movie directly quotes that Ella is not like other girls. Char actually says that's why he likes her when they meet. The movie changes Ella's big triumphant moment from the book, where she tames the ogres, into her literally being told to shut up and stay still so they can eat her, and then Char has to saunter in and save her, when in the book she saves him. So it was just one rant after another while I was watching this film. But Kat, I'll let you take over at this point and hopefully form a more coherent argument.
Well, I will say that this movie is such an insane experience that it's kind of difficult to track my feelings in a coherent way, but I will definitely try. I had a lot of very bad feelings at how the movie handles Ella's curse and as a young woman being ordered to do things. The book sort of hints at this. Obviously, we've talked about, her stepsisters using this curse and other people in her life, but the movie really plays up men ordering Ella to do things. And it made me extremely uncomfortable to watch Ella and Char's first kiss because he says, "Kiss me," and she's ordered to do it. And right at the last minute, he says, "Oh, that's not an order and you're free to do it." And so you get, "Oh, okay, well, I guess it's okay because she's like doing it of her own volition." But it still feels icky, and Anne Hathaway is really acting up the being forced to do things that she doesn't want to do. So you're just like watching this person being ordered to do things. And then later with Prince Char's uncle, he realizes or he learns about Ella's curse. So he's ordering her to do all these like wacky things and dancing and like shaking her butt. It was very uncomfortable, and I did not like that at all. The book definitely just hints at that and gives that as a way that Ella realizes she would be a danger to Char's life. And the movie just goes crazy with it. And then now suddenly she's like gonna kill him. And it was a lot. It was a lot.
I agree with that, Kat, and you made an extremely valid point. In the book, Ella is at the mercy of mainly female characters, Hattie, Olive, and Dame Olga. In the movie, it seems to me that she's mainly at the mercy of male characters for some reason. Slannon the elf, who's supposed to be a sidekick, he bosses her around a fair bit. Char gives his orders as well. And then his uncle, Carrie Elways, who deserves some sort of Oscar for whatever he was doing in this movie, he orders her around as well. So the movie seemed to take the power over Ella from female characters to male characters compared to the book. Gressel, what do you think?
I hadn't thought about that, but I totally have to agree now that I really put some thought into it. So I think the movie actually applies more of what is a fault of a lot of fantasy novels, where you end up setting the one unique female character who is not like other girls, and you surround her by men who, either aid her or hinder her journey. But the book itself is very female dominant, not always in great ways, but it is doing something different, I would say, from what is the norm in a lot of fantasy novels. So yeah, no, I hadn't thought about it, but that is a good valid point.
Oh, thank you. We found some common ground. And while we're on this positivity wave, I have some feminist spawning, and that's mainly that I like how Ella is funny in the book. Of the main couple, she's the funny one, and Char is the humorless one. And too often in stories, the male character is the clown and the female character is the stick in the mud. We've seen the dynamic over the course of this podcast endless times. I'm thinking mainly Fry and Lita from Futurama, for example. So I like this role reversal they have going on in their dynamic. And I also like that Ella's sense of humor is not subtle, dry wit, because usually that's the type of humor that's given to female protagonists, like Dario, for example. Ella's quite the buffoon, and she's willing to go to great lengths to make Char laugh, as you said earlier, Kat. So I did find that endearing.
Yeah, I agree. That was definitely one of the aspects of her character that I liked a lot and that I liked of their relationship. She also has a way with languages and she can pick up languages very easily, and she is the one who's able to communicate with all of these different like species that live in the world, like the ogres and the elves. I thought that was a nice trait for her as well because, he's sort of the dashing prince who's, comes in as like a fighter or ready to go into battle. And the movie takes that like to like a whole other level of like weird politics and whatever is happening in the movie. But in the book, I did like that it was sort of this language based thing. I wasn't crazy about all these like fake made up languages because it was just like a lot. I basically was skimming a lot because it's just like a lot of nonsense. But I do appreciate that she was given that trait.
It was literal gobbledygook.
I will say that when I read Ella Enchanted, I hadn't yet read Lord of the Rings. The order for me was The Hobbit, and then Ella Enchanted, and then Lord of the Rings. So this concept of different fantasy species, if that's a term we're going with, was still new to me at the time. And I was so impressed by the fact that these different species had different languages that I actually tried to memorize the languages in Ella Enchanted as a girl. So I went around saying Athun Sing, which is Ogres for goodbye, for a good long while as a kid. It may not work to our adult eyes, is my point, but I think the languages were, speaking as someone who read this as a little girl, quite fascinating and a great introduction to that idea in fantasy literature for someone who was that young and maybe not quite ready for Lord of the Rings yet.
I can definitely see that. And I think that overall, that's sort of my general feeling about this book is that I am too old for it. I can appreciate aspects of it and I could see myself recommending it to a younger reader. But for me now, it was kind of fine. It was there. I knew how it was going to turn out, especially because it's based on this fairy tale. So I'm just kind of reading it, seeing like and appreciating the ways that it's different from the original fairy tale. But I didn't find myself like overly pulled in or really relating to any characters in any way.
I have thoughts on both of the points you've made, but I'm going to save them for the next segment.
All right, let's go ahead and jump in then into the long-awaited Carthars's Corner. Gristle, go. It's all yours.
You're giving me space to cathart.
Carthar's away.
Yay! Okay, so my main confession, as I hinted earlier, I thought I would like this book. I genuinely came into it thinking that I was going to find a gem that I had missed earlier in my reading experience. I did not like it. And there are a number of reasons that I dislike this book. One, like Kat had said, I am definitely not the intended audience. And we've had books that we've read on the podcast before, like Matilda, where I mentioned that the reason I did not like it was just because I'm not the audience for this book. It missed me. There's stuff about how it's told that just does not work for me. And it's fine for other people, but it's not a book for me. I also disliked other books, like Misery, not necessarily with like rabid fire of hatred or anything, but just because it's not my preferred genre. This book, however, is one of my preferred genres. I should have liked it. I enjoy fairy tale retellings. I have been known to read them over and over again, even when they're intended for a younger reader, which is not something that I usually lean towards. But fairy tale retellings are one of those areas where even if it's intended for an independent reader age, I have really found favorites among that category. I did not like this one because I found it lacking in plot. As I've said, like it just was kind of not really hinging on any real stakes for me. I was frustrated really that the author did so little to world build. She kind of like brings in pieces from other types of fantasy, but she doesn't work with them very well in my opinion. I would say that the language that you guys are talking about is one of the things that bothered me the most because it looks like the kind of writing you get when your cat walks over a keyboard. She does nothing to build a linguistic style. It's just like F, 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 capital K, W, Y, Z. And that's like a word. And then she's got a glossary in the back, and you have to find the glossary of nonsense words in order to figure out what it is because there's no linguistic style to tie them together. So that really just like didn't work for me either. It would have worked for me maybe if she had either developed a real language, which she could have. She could have just developed some basic words for some foundational sentences, or just glossed over it and used italics to imply that they're talking in a different language. It was just like, really? You're just tossing in all these random letters and calling it words? Like, I skimmed over all of that too. As I said before, I found the characters just really bland. I asked myself, would I have liked this? back in the day when I was writing my thesis, but I think I can safely say no. The reason being that around the same time that I was working on my thesis, maybe a couple years earlier, Shrek came out, and my friends were convinced that I would like that movie for the very same reasons. It's fantasy, it's got that like kooky humor, quirky thing going on, and I hate that movie. I do not like it at all. So most of the retellings I like are more about action, the heroine doing something. Ella doesn't do much of anything. Her efforts to defy the curse just really fall short to me. And then the whole thing with, I'm 15, you can marry me now. Just like, sort of like, that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me. And those are all of my cathartic points.
I love Shrek. At least I think I do.
I
I
think
haven't seen it
I
in
think now
many
we have
years.
another thing to not Venn diagram.
Uh-oh, yeah.
But that being said, I agree with both of you. I have had so many successful instances over the course of this podcast wherein I have revisited a childhood favorite like Matilda, like The Secret Garden, like Mary Poppins, and I have found that they are just as amazing as I remember them being. And that was, I'm so sad to admit, not the case for Ella Enchanted. This book meant everything to me for a brief moment in my life. I would say maybe ages 10 to 12. And I will confess that if I had read this today for the first time, I don't know that I would have liked it. Kat, did you want to add anything?
Well, since you mentioned Shrek, I will bring it back to the movie because I felt like the movie was definitely some studio executive mishmash where they said, hey, Shrek was really popular. We should do that, but like live action and like have like a funny, updated fairy tale that's like quirky and weird and sort of modern. And they just like threw all these things in a blender and this insane movie came out.
It does have a dozen billion writers, which is never a good sign.
And there is no
Oh,
more apt
no.
description than what Kat just said.
Yeah,
And among those writers are the 10 things I hate about you writers. So that explains all the crop tops.
that does. And that brings me to one big catharsis that I have about the movie, which is I hated the costumes. Oh, God. Every outfit is terrible. And if I'm going to watch some like big budget Hollywood nonsense, I at least want it to be like a feast on my eyes. I want crazy, expensive costumes. And these costumes looked like something from a high school production of Into the Woods. It
They're
was bad.
Halloween costumes.
Yes.
Not even. This was the kind of stuff they were selling at the Limited too back when the
Yes.
movie was made.
It was just like basic mall wear, which, you know what? Fine. If I'm watching 10 Things I Hate About You, I appreciate seeing like regular 90s clothes, but I definitely don't want to see that in like a fantasy fairy tale type of movie. I want to see like elaborate, rich costumes made of like velvet and shiny material, not weird knitted sweaters and strange crop tops and big belts. It was so bad.
I agree with you. There's only one thing I like about the costumes, and that's that in the mall scene, which is when you have hundreds of different characters, if you look around, I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure I spotted that Ella is the only person wearing blue. And then later on, when she runs into Char, he's also wearing blue. And I thought that was a shout out to Beauty and the Beast because in the Little Town Quiet Village scene of Beauty and the Beast, the opening number Belle, she's the only person in the entire town wearing blue. And then later on, when she meets the Beast, he's also wearing blue in his famous ballroom dress outfit. So I don't know if that was intentional, and I was so upset with this movie that I didn't want to research further to find out. But I thought that was a nice shout out if it was indeed a shout out to that blue is for the special main couple.
I was just too distracted by how cheap her costume looked to really notice anything else. And actually, a few days earlier, I had read a post by somebody I follow on Instagram who like talks about historical costumes, and she was complaining about how there are certain fabrics that are obviously synthetic and you would never have seen this, and why are historical film production companies using these in their films? And that's all I could think about as I was watching Ella traipse around in her like super cheap thin polyester fake velvet blue thing that she was wearing. I was like, this is a Halloween costume I would have bought to pretend to be, you know, a fairy maiden for the Renaissance Fair. Like all I could think about as I was watching that scene.
Why are the giants dressed like Britney Spears, though? I don't get it.
I know. The costumes, this movie is so insane. We haven't even like really touched on it, but Heidi Klum plays one of the giants, and that in and of itself is crazy. And There's singing and dancing and like modern music, which again is something that I attribute to trying to take the success of Shrek. And it just like
Yes.
is
That exactly
crazy.
that. And the songs just don't work for me in the way they're used, even though they're all songs I like.
Oh yeah, I basically my eyes were glazing over anytime the musical numbers were happening because I was just like taken aback. Like, why is this happening? What is going on? Now Ella is gonna start singing karaoke to like a big group of people and it turns into a whole sing-along scene. All right.
They were all so awkward, but I feel like that last musical scene is the most awkward of all. I felt uncomfortable watching it.
Oh my gosh, I know. By the end, when they're, like, going into the last thing and it's the credits, I was just, like, cringing watching these adults do this. It just was yeah, I had a lot of secondary embarrassment watching this movie, which
Yes.
again sort of made
Yep.
me, like it gave me some sort of, like, insane, absurd joy to just, like, laugh a lot and, like, not for the right reasons, but just, like, it was so crazy that it made me laugh, and that was nice. I like laughing, so I can appreciate the movie for that.
I should like this. I really should like this movie. I like Shrek. I think I like Shrek. I don't know. I might be surprised when I
I've
revisit it.
taken you to the core.
You
Oh,
are. I don't know who
no.
I am anymore. I love The Princess Bride. I love silly stuff. I love Gallivant, which we'll talk about in the Rex shortly, but that's probably the closest comparison to this movie I can think of. I like all of those things, or at least I think I did. And I don't understand why this movie does not work for me, but Kat, it's what you were saying. I just had this horrible feeling of secondhand embarrassment watching this movie from beginning to end, and I do not feel that way often, so I don't know. When I chose Ella Enchanted, I thought this is a traumatizing time in all our lives right now. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. We're facing a very tense national election. Let me pick something pleasant, easy to digest, easy to watch, and we can just have a fluffy conversation at this turbulent point. And clearly it did not work out that way. But I'm hoping you found some enjoyment in the badness.
There was a lot of badness to be had.
And with that, we'll go on to our stock ratings. Let's divide them into book and movie separately. Mine, at least, are going to be different, but we shall see for you too. So, Grisel, what are your stock ratings?
Okay, so if we're going with the movie first, I think this will surprise you. I will give it a 2. Because, like Kat said, it was not good. But it was enjoyable in its badness. So I got pleasure just like making fun of it. And I was the first one of our crew to sit down to watch it. So I got to experience it without any preconceived notions, and it was a lot.
It was a lot, and I am surprised by that 2 rating. I thought we were going to go into the negatives for the first time. What about the book?
Okay, so for the book, I will only give it a 1 though. As I said, I think I was pretty clear. I did not like this book for personal reasons. Not the audience. Not a book that works for me as far as plot or timeline or narrative style, language. So all the reasons that I stated before, I'll give it a 1 just because it is what it is. It might work for, the audience it's intended for. It's fine. I won't ever read it.
Grisel, that's it. I am exiling you to the neighboring kingdom for rating this movie more highly than the book.
It was not the worst I've seen.
Wow. Okay. Kat, save me.
Well, I'll start with the book to add some positive notes, although not too positive, but I will give the book a 2 socks rating. I thought the book was perfectly fine. Like I said, it didn't like pull me in, but I acknowledge I'm not the audience for it. And as someone who reads a lot of books, I can acknowledge and even appreciate that, like, not every book has to be the best book I've ever read in my life. And so while I was reading this book, I was enjoying it. I thought it was totally fine, but it's definitely something that I'll probably kind of forget about in a year and like not remember the specifics about because it just didn't really touch my heart in any way. But again, I could see the appeal to it and I could see recommending it to younger readers who are interested in this type of story. For the movie, I will give it a 1 sock rating. It was insane and bad, and I did laugh a lot during it, but I just can't give it any more than the 1 sock. It was so bizarre and strange, and I actually had to stop the movie about halfway through and finish it the next day because I was like, "This is too much for my brain to handle," because I just, like, was expecting a pretty straightforward fairy tale, sweet little story, and it was just not at all that. I'll say that my favorite part of the movie was the fact that they play the song "Strange Magic" by the band ELO, and that happens in the opening credits, so it was all downhill from there.
Well, I'm not surprised. I'm rephrase. I actually am surprised that you gave it a 1 sock rating and not a 0 sock rating, so I will take it. I will start with the movie as well then, and I'm going to surprise you with my rating as well. I will also give it 2 socks. I will never watch this movie again, and I had to pause many times to get through it. But those 2 socks are out of solidarity because I think this movie is to a lot of people what the 10th Kingdom is to me. That is, we know objectively it's not good, but if you saw it at a sensitive period, it means a lot to you. And so, 2 solidarity socks. I was clearly out of my sensitive period by the time Ella Enchanted the movie came along, and so I cannot appreciate it in that way.
I would like to offer a defense of the 10th Kingdom as a masterpiece of a work. By comparison.
Pat,
Wow,
your rebuttal.
masterpiece. All right, I'm holding you to that, writing that down and remembering it for our next minisode.
It's on the record. We can't take it back. As for the book, like I said in Catharsis Corner, I was sad to discover that if I had read this book for the first time today, I would not have loved it. However, I did read it as a little girl. And based on my memories of how I reacted to this book at the time, I think it's an excellent introduction to high fantasy for younger readers. Recalling my past little self who was so obsessed with Ella Enchanted, at the time I had really 2 stories that I loved in terms of being about young girls on quests. It was Ella Enchanted and it was A Wrinkle in Time. And I don't recall having anything else like that back then. So, based on those memories, I'm going to give this book 4 socks. I don't know that I would recommend it to readers of our age anymore. I'm pretty sure that I would not, unless you want to see something you missed, like in your case, Grisel, but I would still recommend it for little girls today.
10th Kingdom forever!
All right. Well, that's clearly going to be one of our recommendations. So let's go on to our reading and viewing recs. I really, really loved Ella Enchanted back then. I think that's been made obvious. And as a result, I read everything Gail Carson Levine wrote for years. I even skipped school as a teenager, which was a really big deal back then for a studious goody two shoes like me, to attend one of her book talks when she came to my hometown. And I stood in line in the rain just to have her autograph my battered old copy of Ella Enchanted. Thus, for the sake of my child self, I will give a blanket recommendation to all her books. Although, when I looked up her bibliography just before this episode, it seems the last one I read was A Tale of Two Castles until now. I have started reading the 2018 Ella Enchanted prequel, Ogre Enchanted, and I plan to review it for our next minisode. And yes, I am going in with an open mind. As for their older books, my memories have faded over the years, especially since the only one I used to reread constantly was Ella Enchanted. But I do remember that my favorite of her non-Ella books was the Princess Tales series, which are 6 very short books with unique tall and narrowed signs. You'll know them when you see them. Like Ella Enchanted, they are fairy tale retellings, as are many of her works, and I would recommend those to any fans of Ella Enchanted. For more fairy tale retellings, check out episode 3 of this podcast, The Infamous The 10th Kingdom, which itself is a mishmash of fairy tales and which we're going to revisit in our next minisode. We will link to that episode's show notes in this episode's show notes, so you have a convenient and rather long list of additional fairy tale themed reading recs, everything from Neil Gaiman's Stardust to the Fables comic series to the Into the Woods musical. I will also add here 3 other authors that I read extensively back in the day along with Gail Carson Levine and who often wrote fairy tale retellings, and I will give a starting point for each one, again with a caveat that I haven't read these books since high school at the most. First is Shannon Hale and her novel Princess Academy, especially if you like the finishing school part of Ella Enchanted. Second is Donna Jo Napoli and her novel Zell, which is a retelling of Rapunzel. And third is Robin McKinley and her novel The Blue Sword. And Grisel, I'm sure you have more to say about Robin McKinley, so I left the beauty recommendation for you.
I wasn't actually going to recommend Robin McKinley because I don't think she's that much of a read-alike other than the fantasy retelling element, so I will leave it at that.
Okay, in that case, I'll jump in and say Beauty and Rose Daughter, which is her other Beauty and the Beast retelling.
And I'll just jump in and second the recommendation of Zell. That is a book that I loved as a young reader. I have not revisited it. I tried to find a copy of it as soon as I finished Ella Enchanted because I wanted to see if I still loved it as much as I did back then. And unfortunately, I couldn't find an ebook of it quickly enough to read for this podcast, but I will still give it a recommendation.
I also recommend Zell. I read it as an adult. Still holds up.
That is surprising and wonderful to hear. Finally, for an adult non-fantasy novel, check out The Blue Castle by Ella Montgomery of Anne of Green Gables fame. If you've been hearing the podcast in order, you know that I read it recently, just this summer, and I'm recommending it because you don't always need a curse to suffer from being overly obedient. The Blue Castle is about a 29-year-old quote-unquote old maid named Valerie Sterling who has spent her entire life obeying her overbearing relatives. When she finds out that she has only 1 year left to live due to a heart problem, she rebels for the first time in her life. The first half of the book is a comedy, the second half of the book is a romance, just like Ella Enchanted. I think we can all infer which half of the book I prefer, but overall, I enjoyed the book greatly. In fact, I enjoyed it so much that I named my Animal Crossing island Blue Castle. It was wonderful to dive back into the writing of Ella Montgomery this summer after so many years away, and I strongly recommend it if you read Anne of Green Gables growing up, like we all did.
I actually have never read this. I have read other books by Ella Montgomery, but never The Blue Castle. It sounds really good and fun, and I will have to say that Valency Sterling sounds like a name that Anne Shirley would give one of her characters in Anne of Green Gables. It's a mouthful.
It really does. Crystal, you read it.
I have. I think I have read all of Ellen Montgomery except for her short stories. I do love The Blue Castle, though. It's, I think, her only adult work. She does have some in, like, her gothic short stories, but as far as a novel, it's the only one she wrote with an adult as the main character.
I think Blue Castle is one for our Venn diagram. And finally, for a viewing rec to go along with the Ella Enchanted movie, check out the musical comedy fantasy TV series Gallivant, which, as I mentioned earlier, is probably the closest match to the movie that I can think of. It's also silly and irreverent and full of songs, and yet I think it's also good too, or at least I used to think so when it aired, which was only a few years ago, but who knows anything anymore. I will also recommend the infamous The 10th Kingdom TV miniseries itself, yet again, the masterpiece, as Grisel called it, which also features the protagonist singing karaoke to Queen in a medieval setting, because apparently that's a thing. And again, we're going to talk about it in our next minisode, so please join us. Kat, what are your reading recs?
Well, for my reading recs, I have a few that kind of deal with different aspects of Ella Enchanted. So, for more of the going to school in a fairy tale type of world, I will recommend the School for Good and Evil series by Soman Chianani. And I think there are 4 books in the series. It's pretty fun. It's definitely not great, but it's a good interesting sort of telling of these fairy tale characters, and they have to go to school to learn how to be quote unquote good or quote unquote evil, and a lot of shenanigans ensue. For dealing more with new stepfamily and spoiled siblings, I'll recommend a YA book called Spoiled by Heather Cox and Jessica Morgan. This is definitely not a fairy tale story, but it's got a lot of similarities. It's a 16-year-old girl who discovers her father is this famous singer who lives in LA. So she moves out to his family's house and now has 2 sisters to deal with. And it's a whole dealing with a big city life and fame and fortune and such. But it's very fun and funny. And the 2 writers actually have a blog called The Fug Report where they
I
and
am literally Googling that right now.
oh
I'm like, wait,
yes.
I know those names. It's them, really?
Yes, and I love their writing, I love their blog, so if you like that blog and you like sort of that irreverent style and talking about fashion, I definitely recommend Spoiled, and it's actually also a series. There's another book in the series as well.
And fun fact, Jessica was the one who wrote the X-Files recaps for the old snarky website Television with a Pity. Do you remember those?
Yes, I love that site. That's really funny. I did not know that. And then for my viewing recommendations, I have one that I'm shocked that did not appear when I revisited your recommendations on the 10th Kingdom episode, and that is the movie Enchanted. I think that this movie is really great. I saw it in the theaters and I fell in love with Amy Adams. I was happy, as always, to see James Marsden on my screen. And it's a much better tongue-in-cheek, updated, modern fairy tale type of story. So I highly recommend Enchanted. For my other viewing recommendations, I have another movie that's a retelling of a fairy tale, and it's a movie starring Barbara Stanwyck and Gary Cooper. So it's an old black and white movie, and it's a retelling of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Only in this movie, Barbara Stanwyck is a nightclub singer who's on the run from her mobster boyfriend and has to seek shelter with Gary Cooper and a group of professors who all live together while they're working on an encyclopedia. And so each of the different professors has a different specialty. And Gary Cooper is a linguist, and he takes Barbara Stanwyck in because he's interested in learning all about her slang-ridden language. And it's very fun and silly. Barbara Stanwyck is amazing. I love her very much, and she is really good in this movie. And it's just like a really fun, funny updating of Snow White fairy tale.
That sounds awesome. I'd never watched that before.
You would never know based on the title Ball of Fire what it's about. So I remember like watching it for the first time and about 30 minutes in being like, wait a minute, this is a fairy tale retelling. For my last recommendation, I'll harken back to something that I brought up in the Princess Bride episode. And back then I gave a sweeping general recommendation to watch operas because there are a lot of them that are based on fairy tales and folk tales. But I will specifically mention the opera Rusalka by Anton Dvorak, and it's a version of The Little Mermaid. I personally think that this is a really great opera, and it's also very entertaining and amusing to me because in this opera, the lead soprano basically cannot sing for most of the second act, if not all of it, because she gives up her voice to become a human, and there's something very entertaining about watching an opera where the lead actually can't sing. So I recommend that one.
Thank you for bringing some class into our episode, Kat. Krista, what are your recommendations?
So I struggled at first to come up with recommendations, which is not uncommon lately. But I did come up with two fairly instantly, which was Shrek and Frozen. Neither work that I particularly care for, but which felt to have that vibe of the Ella Enchanted movie with people breaking into song and finishing each other's sentences. So
And
I
sandwiches.
recommend those. And sandwiches. So I recommend those two. And I also recommend, once again, Miracle Workers Dark Ages, because I think it has a lot of the same feel as that mall scene at the beginning of the movie. A lot of Miracle Workers is concerned with like modern situations in an old-timey setting, so it has that vibe. It's a good watch alike if that's what you liked about Ella Enchanted. Now, because I did have a hard time coming up with a read alike, I'm just going to recommend some works that capture elements of what I found in Ella Enchanted. The first one being The Black Unicorn, which is part of a series by Tanith Lee, particularly for a bitter heroine, because I found Ella to be a very bitter character because of her circumstances. So I'll recommend that one. I'll also recommend Juliet Marillier's Daughter of the Forest for A Curse That Cannot Be Shared. And trigger warnings, all the trigger warnings for this book, because it is an adult fantasy and not light on the violence towards women. And as we were having our discussion, I came up with two additional recommendations. One, Graceling by Kristen Kishore. I've recommended Fire before, although I may have recommended Graceling also. I have to look through a massive list of recommendations. So Fire is actually my favorite in this series, but Graceling has that feel of this person might be a danger to others because of a power they possess. So that was an aspect that I found similar. And just lastly, all of Tamara Pierce's books. Not because they are like Ella Enchanted, but because they are what I wanted Ella Enchanted to be.
I used to read her books around the time I was reading Ella Enchanted, and I can vouch on behalf of my 10 to 12-year-old self for the Song of the Lioness series. I really liked the Alana books growing up.
All very good. I particularly like The Protector of the Small, but all of her books, just read them all. Binge them if you have to.
Any final thoughts as we wrap up this enchanting episode?
I have still been distracted by the fact that Hugh Dancy was 30 years old in this movie.
Yes, he looks like a child.
Yes!
I'm shocked.
On that note, I Googled it while we were talking, and according to my Google search, Anne Hathaway dated Hugh Dancy from 2003 to 2005. They were in love and made the red carpet rounds, but he was 8 years older than her, and Anne wasn't ready to settle down, allegedly. So there we go, you've got some gossip with your Ella Enchanted episode. That concludes this episode of the Bluestocking Circle podcast. For the show notes, visit thebluestockingcircle.com. Find us on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, Pinterest, and pretty much everywhere at Bluestock Circle. That's Blue, S-O-X, Circle. Email us at thebluestockingcircle@gmail.com and join the conversation. You may also find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, and YouTube, so please rate, review, and subscribe to help us grow.
Cheers! You're steering this crazy ship.
There's a lot of water coming in over the sides, you guys.